Well, Jono, one of the most popular items to fit to your four-wheel drive has to be a snorkel. And if you're going to fit a snorkel with the idea of doing some river crossings, you'd be pretty silly not to go out and fit yourself some diff breathers. Yeah. So today we're going to have a look at installing some diff breathers at home. We're in the workshop, but it'll give us the opportunity to get the car up and show you guys exactly how to do it, get underneath nice and clean. So how long would we expect the install to take, and what tools do we need to take this on at home?
Mark, I reckon this is a pretty easy install. I think it'll probably take us about an hour or a little bit more, and we'll just need some basic hand tools, sockets, Allen keys, that kind of thing, and some additional cable ties which are included in the kit.
Let's get this Ranger up in the air, we'll get under it and get started.
Within the box you'll find all the instructions, some cable ties, enough hose to reach the front and rear diffs, the diff breather manifold, as well as all the connectors to go into the port. There are also a pair of blanking plugs to reduce the manifold from a 4-port to a 2-port diff breather. If you have any under-vehicle protection, you'll need to remove this before you get started. Today we're going to start with the rear diff. Pretty much all vehicles you'll find are the same. Your car will have an original diff breather in it, it's just likely not long enough to ensure the water won't ingress in the case you cross a deep river crossing. Today we're working on a Ford Ranger XLT. The first tool we're going to need is a 14mm open-ended spanner. Once you've got the fitting hand loose, keep unwinding the fitting with your hand. You might find the hose gets a little bit tight, but persevere until the fitting pops out of the diff casing. The next step is to insert one of the new diff breather ports into the diff housing. This will ensure no unwanted debris can make its way into the diff during installation. Now, simply tighten the fitting with a 13mm open-ended spanner. Next we're going to move to the front differential. Coming from on top of the diff housing, you'll find an existing rubber tube. In this particular case, it's identified with a yellow marking. We're going to remove this line from the clasp, trim it off, and then insert the ARB diff breather line into the existing tube. With a pair of side cutters, trim the existing tube as high as you can to allow the most amount of hose to play with later. In the case of the Ford Ranger, it's just not practical nor necessary to replace the original fitting, so instead we're going to insert the ARB tubing 15 to 20mm into the existing breather tube. At this point we want to measure out about 1.5 metres of tubing and trim off the rest of the coil, which will be sufficient to pass up through to the engine bay to where we're going to install the manifold. Do your best to find the most direct path between the top of the diff housing and the bottom of the engine bay where we're going to mount the diff breather manifold. Be sure to keep the tubing away from hot elements including the exhaust pipe, and where possible try to follow some existing wiring in the area which we can provide a practical place to secure the tubing off later. Now we're moving back to the rear diff. We've threaded our tubing through and over the top of the fuel tank, following some of the existing lines. Now onto the diff breather. Firmly slide the end of the air tube over the barbed fitting. Be sure to allow enough line for the vehicle to extend to full flex on the rear axles. In this instance, we've tied off to some of the existing wiring harness. From the rear axle, we've taken the tubing and followed the chassis rail right up to in front of the fuel tank, where we've caught up with some existing wiring, and we're following this right up into the engine bay. Be sure to secure the tubing with cable ties roughly every 300mm as you go along. That's the underneath of the vehicle complete, and now it's time to head up into the engine bay. The next step is to assemble the diff breather manifold. First we're going to put in the 2 blanking screws. Of course, if you were running transmission and transfer case breathers, you'd be connecting the hoses here. Tighten all of the outlets and blanking screws with a 13mm spanner. There's no need to match specific breathers to specific ports on the manifold, so connect each wherever suits your install best. Once you've found a suitable location to mount the manifold, mark up the area, and then you can either use the supplied self-tapping screws or, as we're doing here, pre-drill and bolt up. Of course, if you're going to perform any drilling work, be sure to touch up the holes with some paint to avoid rust. Once the manifold is secure, trim the 2 lengths of tubing off to an appropriate level to connect them to the barbed ports on the manifold, remembering that these are simply push connections with no additional fittings required. Now you can screw the air filter cap on to the front of the manifold.
So here we are, we've fitted the front and rear diff breathers. A really relatively painless job, could definitely be done at home. Otherwise, very happy to do it for you here in one of our ARB fitting bays. So if you're interested in getting yourself a set of diff breathers, give your local ARB store a call. If you've got any questions, don't be afraid to ask.